Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Richard W. Hughes on the stage, please.
Thank you very much. Usually I talk about ruby and sapphire, but today I'm going to talk about a hobby of mine, which is jade. To start with, I'd like to give a special thanks to two friends of mine, without whom help I couldn't do what I'm doing here today. And so that is Jason Cao and Adam, both from Tongji University in Shanghai. And they have really done a lot to help me understand this most Chinese of gem materials, jade. And so I just first wanted to thank them for that. I also want to say a few words about pronunciation. This is the Chinese character for jade, and it's pronounced something like this, yu, yu. And it's a really hard thing for me to pronounce. I have to make my mouth look a little bit like a fish, you know, something like this, yu, yu, or some people might call it the Donald Trump mouth. So I want you to please forgive me if I mispronounce some of these Chinese names and places, because it's very difficult for me because I don't read or speak Chinese. But I also know that my name in Chinese doesn't come out at all like Richard Hughes. And so I guess we're even for that. I first started learning about jade in 1977 when I went to Burma. And I knew nothing about jade at the time, but I was shown some pieces in Burma. And that's when I first really developed a love for jade. Later on, I saw fine pieces of jade, things like this. And I actually visited the jade mines in Burma on 3 different occasions in these years. It's quite an unusual place, very remote, not easy to get to. The main mines are located around the small town of Pakhan. And the first time I went there, it took me 3 days just to go 45 miles. Conditions something like this. It's a very rugged area, and what we found was an incredible world where jade was being mined in the hills of Upper Burma. And this is the kind of thing that they're looking for. Most jade has a skin on the outside. It makes it very, very difficult to understand the quality inside. And that's one of the challenges of jade, and perhaps some of the fun, too. Fine pieces of jade from Burma, of course, are jadeite jade. And so the top color is an emerald green like this, or even something like this. And you can see the prices that fine jadeite jade fetches. What I hope to teach you today is that there's a whole nother kind of jade that most people are entirely unaware of. 1994, I went to New Zealand. I had seen Chinese jade carvings very often in the Far East, but I walked into a small store in Auckland in the North Island of New Zealand, and they had carvings of which I had never seen anything like it, things like this. There was an entire indigenous industry in New Zealand carving jade at a level, in my own opinion at the time, was better than anything that I had seen in the Far East. Most of these designs were based on Maori carvings from the past. 1999, I visited Guatemala, where they also have jadeite jade. And these are some ancient carvings from Central America done in the Guatemalan jade. This particular piece is from Costa Rica. And you can see that jade has been treasured around the world. Wherever it was found, it was always considered to be the most valuable gem. 2000, I went to Russia to explore the jade mines there. There are a couple different places, 3 different places in Russia. In the far north of the polar Urals, and we'll see if this works, at a place here, inside the Arctic Circle, they find jade. But the mining season, of course, is very short because of the location. You can only mine 2 or 3 months of the year. And they find jadeite jade there. They also find jadeite jade outside of Abakan in Khakassia. And you might wonder, well, where is that in location to the rest of the world? Well, if you're in Bangladesh and you go north, and you keep going north, and you keep going north, you'll eventually pass through China, you'll pass through Mongolia, and then when you go north from Mongolia, you'll end up in Abakan. And they do have jade there. A lot of fine nephrite jade, rather than jadeite jade, comes from the area to the southwest of Lake Baikal. And Lake Baikal, as some of you may know, is the world's deepest lake, and it contains something like, 15 or 20% of the world's fresh water. It's an incredibly deep lake, and they do find a kind of white nephrite in that area as well, and they also get some green nephrite. This is the area in the polar Urals, and this is the vehicle that transported us to the mines. Much, much better than the methods that I used in Burma. This vehicle never gets stuck, unlike the various jeeps and so forth in Burma. And this is the gentleman who first discovered the polar Ural jade mines. He spent 10 years looking for the jade based on the geology, and only after 10 years did he discover the real stone. 2009, I had the opportunity to go to Guangzhou in China. I had heard that they had a very large jade market there, and so I wanted to visit it. Now, Guangzhou is just outside of Hong Kong, inside mainland China. It's a very old jade market there. It's been operating for hundreds of years. And as China got rid of the communist era, the jade market was revived. There are a number of places in Guangdong province in China that are important for jade, particularly this place, Yangmei. They have a bustling market there. Interestingly enough, it operates at night. Then in Sihui and Pingzhou, they also have big jade markets. Most of these markets, including Guangzhou, are for jadeite jade. And this is what the market in Guangzhou looks like. Thousands and thousands of vendors in the market, and sometimes it has almost a disco atmosphere to it. Tiny streets packed with people, mostly selling jadeite jade. During my first visit there, I wandered off into another part of the market that was outdoors, and I saw some people that looked like they were from Central Asia. And they were selling an entirely different kind of stone. And I soon realized that these were Uyghur people from Western China, and they were selling the original jade. And then I went into a shop, and it was almost like entering a church, where each piece of jade was displayed with tremendous elegance and reverence. And I had an epiphany at that point, because I had always heard about Chinese jade, but I'd never seen it. I'd never touched it. And this is a material that you just want to touch. It has a softness to it that is incredible. It's like no other material that you've ever seen. And each piece was laid out on black with a beautiful light on top of it, and I was in love. So at that point, I said I must try to visit the place where those stones come from in Western China. I had the opportunity, thanks to Adam and Jason, last year with my family to visit the jade deposits of Hetian in Western China. Hetian, if you look on English maps, it will be called Khotan, and this is the story of that jade. So this is where it is located, in the far, far west of China, just north of Pakistan. And in the Kunlun Mountains, every year when the snows melt, they wash jade down into the valleys. This used to be on the Silk Road. It was a very important trading point, and that's probably why the jade eventually made its way east to China. Here you can see where Khotan or Hetian is located. not far from Kashgar, to the north of the Kunlun Mountains. Here's a little closer view of it. You can see some of these other places in Central Asia that are very important historically. Dunhuang is the place where they found the Diamond Sutra. It was the first printed book ever found on Earth, and it predated the Gutenberg Bible by some 500 years. We went there to visit the white and black Jade rivers. And it was said that as the snow thawed in the mountains, that the river would wash down the jade boulders. And in China, they believe that jade has a certain quality to it. It's a masculine quality. You've all heard of yin-yang. It's the masculine, feminine, the opposites, up, down, yin-yang. And so, since jade is masculine, they believed that you needed something feminine in order to attract it. And what could be more feminine than very young virgins naked in the river? And so this is from an illustration from an encyclopedia several hundred years ago in China, illustrating how jade would be collected in these waters. I guarantee you that that's not how it really happened, because the water is ice cold, coming straight out of glaciers. But anyway, that was how they imagined it in China. And so we visited the rivers, and we found still today there are people picking the boulders out of the gravels alongside the river. This particular gentleman, we asked him if he had anything. He said, "Yeah, I found one piece today." And he held it up for us, and we bought it from him. And currently, that piece is in Shanghai, where a carver is going to carve it for us. And you can see my daughter and I looking at some of these gravels. A lot of the material that has possible to be mined is gone. And so these stones are becoming more and more rare today, and you would be shocked at the prices that a fine piece of Hertian jade fetches today, in the tens, hundreds of thousands, or after it's carved, in the millions of dollars. They also have a market in Hertian, and you can see some of the Uyghurs there who are selling their wares. Here you can see the way these pebbles are laid out on display. One thing you have to notice is that the pebbles usually have a skin, and it is this skin that partially creates the value. Because when the boulder has a nice skin on it, then a carver can utilize that and produce something extraordinary. The other thing you have to know is that most of the skins are fake. Most of the staining that you see on the outside has been faked, and it's sometimes very difficult to tell the difference. This is a time-honored trade, as they say. And these are the kind of scenes that you see in the market in Hertian. This particular gentleman, we met him in the market in Kashgar, and I could almost imagine his wife saying, "Could you go down to the market and get me a loaf of jade?" Now, there's also jade that is quarried from hard rock mines. And this material is much less valuable than the pebbles that come from the rivers. Even though it's the same material, where the very best material be a snow white, or they call it mutton fat color, but the material from the rivers is many, many, many times more valuable. The reason is that if you're a carver, you want to have the river jade because it's been tumbled for thousands of years. And so any areas that are imperfect will probably have broken away, leaving just the pure material. It's very similar to alluvial gemstones from other deposits. And so this material, this river jade, is far more uniform, and it doesn't have the fractures that the mountain jade, like what you see here, has. And so if you're a carver and you're going to spend a year working on a piece, you don't want to discover a crack in the 9th month. And so the river jade is many, many times more valuable than the mountain jade. And again, you can see these stains that occur on the stones. And that's what they do with it. They utilize this staining to create beautiful pieces of art. Stuff like this. You know, China has a history of 8,000 years of jade. It's hard to imagine. China is the longest continually surviving civilization on Earth. And for 8,000 years, they've been treasuring this stone that we call jade. Originally, they started making things like this. This particular piece comes from a burial dig, and it's about 5,000 years old. Here's a huang, which is a symbol of the north, and this one is also, you know, thousands of years old. They even made jade books, where each page of the book would be engraved into jade. Speaking of books, this particular book was made in New York in 1906, and it was made by a man named Herbert Bishop, who assembled the largest fine jade collection outside of China. And he decided to bequeath his collection to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, and to document it, he commissioned this book. This book, at the time of publication, was the world's most expensive book. It's 2 elephant folios that are about this big, and each plate was designed very carefully, it's printed on special paper. When they finished the book, they threw the plates and the type away so that it could never be reproduced again. A copy of this just came up a couple years ago at Christie's, and it sold for just under $300,000 for this book. And these are some of the illustrations showing the ancient methods of carving jade. Now, this is from a book that was published in 1950, and you can see that the methods haven't changed that much at that time. Here's another plate from the Bishop book, and you can see many of the tools that they operate are all done manually with foot pedals, and you see the same thing again as of 1950. You can see the carvings that they're doing. And even children were involved. In fact, jade carving was generally something that was handed down from father to son or father to daughter. It was a family tradition, and that had a big impact because by the 1950s, most of it was very derivative. There wasn't a lot of original work being done, which is why when I saw the carvings in New Zealand, I was so excited because they were fresh, they were new. Things like this have been done for hundreds of years in China. But in the 1960s, things began to change. The Chinese government decided that they could get foreign exchange by training people to do certain crafts. And rather than choosing people who already had a skill, they chose people based on their artistic ability. And that really pushed change in China to the point where today we're in a golden renaissance age of jade carving. And I think you'll agree after you see some of the stuff I'm going to show you. The other thing that changed was power tools. Instead of everything being operated manually, they had electricity. And so they were able to take something that took 2 years to do, now they can do it in 2 months. Tungsten steel gravers can be used today. And this makes possible something that's never been done in the past, where you can actually create calligraphy on the jade if you're skillful, in the same way that a Chinese painter paints on a scroll. It's really incredible to see. Create designs like this. All of this you're seeing is in Hertian jade. The most valuable color is not green, but white. Today we're seeing jade as art. I like this quote, which I found in a book by an American jade carver, and he said that this Frenchman said that perfection is achieved not where there is nothing more to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. And that, I think, sums up carving and sculpture in jade. I'll show you a few samples of some of the modern carvers in China today. This is Master Zai Yiwei. He only uses Hertian jade, and he makes replicas of Chinese ink and wash paintings, things like this. You see, it's just magnificent. Master Yi Ting, his specialty is eggshell jade, where pieces are carved as thin as a single millimeter. And when you see it, it's incredible. Just amazing. Of course, one mistake and the whole piece will be destroyed. It takes patience and a tremendous amount of talent. Ma Hongwei gives a nod to the past. One of China's great art forms are bronzes, and these have been made for thousands of years. And so what he does is he takes something like this, an ancient bronze, and he carves it in jade with a modern twist. Incredible to see. Stuff like this. And one of my favorite carvers, Yang Shi in Suzhou, and he does amazing things. So he only works in Hertian jade. And you see this kind of detailed work that he does. Here you can see how he's incorporated the imperfections of the boulder into something truly beguiling, like this. Probably the top carver in China today is Wu Desheng. He lives in Shanghai, and he is very wealthy because his work is so valued, and he's recreating in his land a traditional Chinese studio with a courtyard and everything like that, all done in a traditional style. And he's famous for doing nudes. Now you have to understand that in China, before the 20th century, you would never see nudes done in jade. It was considered inappropriate. But then many Chinese, they started to go to Europe, particularly to Paris, to study art, and they saw what was being done in Europe, and they returned, and they brought with them the idea that you could carve nudes in jade. Here's one piece. This is actually done in coral. He actually works in other materials, not just jade, but look at this. Simply magnificent. And I've always felt that, when you're in the presence of genius, you should try to get some of it to rub off on you. And Wu Desheng gladly agreed to this. This is a gentleman in Shanghai, and his specialty is large carvings. He actually works in jadeite jade rather than Hertian jade. And he told us a story. He actually was in the same class as Wu Desheng when the Chinese government started this jade carving project. And he had been working on a carving for a very long time. It had several legs, something like this. And accidentally, he broke off one of the 4 legs. And he showed it to his teacher, and his teacher said, "Oh, that's no problem at all. We'll just make it with 3 legs." And he grabbed the piece, bang, threw it against the wall. Start over. Yeah, it's not easy carving jade. Jade, sometimes it moves into the realms of humorous things. Here's a house, and you turn it around and you see what happens inside the house. Here's another one done by the same carver. And then you see things like this that are simply sublime. Incredible. What they're doing today in China is beyond description. Now I want to switch gears a little bit and tell you about a love story. Some of you may have heard of this man, Joseph Needham. He was a professor at Cambridge University, and he was really a boy wonder. By the age of 24, he was fluent in a half a dozen languages, and he had written a very important book on cellular biology. In fact, it was one of the first books ever authored on cellular biology. He was given membership in the Royal Society, which in the UK is something akin to a Nobel Prize, at the age of 24. He moved into a special office at Cambridge, and Cambridge has courtyards, and each of them has a letter, and he moved into the office K1. Now, why am I talking about this Occidental when I'm really talking about an Oriental subject? Well, I hope to make that clear. So I said Needham was a cellular biologist. He was a Morris dancer, which is a unique form of dancing that came from the East but was mainly popularized in the UK and involves tying bells to your wrists and dancing around. He was a gymnosophist, and probably none of you know what that is. It's a nudist. He liked to take his clothes off, go swimming nude and stuff like that. So he was a nudist. And he played the accordion. I'm not sure if he played the accordion while he was nude, but anyway, he was an unusual man. He was a Marxist and a Christian, a chain smoker, and he was a notorious womanizer. In fact, when he married his wife Dorothy in 1924, and he stayed married to her his whole life, he said, you know, you probably will want to be with other people, and I will want to be with other people, and so that's fine. So he had an open marriage back in the 1920s. 1937, something unusual happened. He had a knock on his door, and there was a young Chinese woman standing there, and she had heard of Joseph Needham because he was very well known in his field. She said she expected to see a man with a long white beard, and instead she saw this Harry Potter-like person. And she immediately fell in love with him. And she was the PhD student of Joseph's wife, Dorothy, and they got along famously. Eventually, they all lived on the same street in Cambridge. But anyway, 1938 was when Joseph consummated his relationship with this young lady. And after they made love for the first time, of course, he took a cigarette, lit a cigarette, gave it to her, gave it to him, and then he said, "How do you say this in Chinese?" And she got up and she wrote out the Chinese characters, which translate as fragrant smoke. And at that point, Needham became fascinated. How could you put into these simple lines this idea? And so he became fascinated with Chinese. Within a year, he was nearly fluent in Chinese. He taught himself. He was a brilliant guy. And he became so good with Chinese that his girlfriend or mistress, she had to get him a proper Chinese teacher because she was busy with her work. But he became completely fluent in written and spoken Chinese. 1939, of course, the Japanese invasion of China was in full swing. And this was a terrible thing, as any Chinese can tell you. But what was interesting, not just about the massacres and so forth, but the way the Japanese targeted the intellectual life of China. They actually targeted Chinese universities to try and destroy them, to try and bring China to its knees. And so China did something very unusual. They moved the universities. Beijing University moved to Kunming. Shanghai University moved to Chengdu. They physically took the entire university, the libraries and everything, and moved them to the interior of the country. And despite what the British and the French and the other Europeans had done to China, China needed help, and they sent a professor to England to ask for assistance. And the British government said, well, maybe we can send somebody to see what you need, and then we'll try to help you. They sent Joseph Needham. Before he left for China, his mistress, Gui Jin, she said, you're going to go over there, and you're going to be like all the other Europeans. You're going to think you know it all, and actually you don't. There are many things that developed in China that you don't know about. Keep an open mind. And so he finally arrived in China in 1943. And he flew over the hump from Calcutta and so forth into Kunming. And he was staying at the British consul's house, and he saw a pear tree outside, and there was a Chinese man who was grafting the pear tree. And he watched him do it. He became fascinated. And he said, you know, I've watched, to himself, he said, I've seen my father do this many times in our backyard, and this man is doing it in a completely different way. Not better necessarily, but different. He became fascinated. He decided, I want to learn more. He went to get a scholar's robe made, which is a traditional Chinese dress for scholars. He was a scholar. And he watched the tailor and the way the tailor used these old units of measurement and so forth, and then added all the stuff up on an abacus. And he was fascinated. And so he started to research this, and he found out that the abacus went probably back 1,500 or 2,000 years, far longer than had been reported in either Chinese literature or in Western literature. And he's like, I'm an amateur. I'm just a cellular biologist. I bet there's all kinds of things waiting to be discovered here. And so he decided to travel around the country. He spent 3 years in China, traveled all around the country, trying to catalog all the discoveries made by Chinese. And it was an incredible catalog. Finally, when he got back to Cambridge, he was asked to join an organization that the United Nations was creating, and they wanted to call it UNESCO. And he said, no, it can't just be that. It can't just be education. It has to be science, too. Joseph Needham put the S in UNESCO. Okay? And then he said to the Cambridge University Press, he said, I've got an idea for a book about science and civilization in China. I want to make this book. And they said, sure, it sounds good. He had been published before. He was a very well-known guy. And then he started doing it, and he said, well, actually, it's going to be 2 books. And then 2 became 3, and 3 became 6. It eventually became 17 volumes, 27 books documenting Chinese civilization and science. An incredible, incredible body of work that is still today, after his death, being added to. If you're interested to learn more about Joseph Needham, I recommend that you read his book, Simon Winchester's book, The Man Who Loved China. And you can also watch Winchester speak about Joseph Needham on YouTube. Some great stuff out there. These are some of the things that China discovered. Printing, gunpowder, the compass, stirrups, chains, wheelbarrows, arch bridges, suspension bridges, dams, the calculator, and of course, toilet paper. You probably don't know this. China also invented football. This is a painting from the Sung Dynasty, clearly showing people playing football. It's an incredible thing. And of course, China invented this thing that we call Jade. You know, when Needham was doing his work, he became fascinated by Chinese characters. And I was thinking about that, and I was thinking, you know, is it possible that we who have alphabet languages have lost something in the process? Okay? In learning our words with these tiny letter pieces, we lost our ability to express emotion through the act of writing. Is that possible? And I had this epiphany Earlier this year, when I was asked to sign a book, and I decided I would try to write the names in Chinese, the first time I'd ever tried that. Married to a Chinese lady for many years, worked for Chinese people for so many years, I'd never even given that a thought. And as I was doing it, I realized that there was something there, something that Joseph Needham saw too. This is what in China is known as the four treasures. It's a brush, ink, paper, and inkstone. Why are they called the four treasures? Because this is really what separates us as human beings from all the other animals. Through these four things, we have the ability to share our thoughts with other people in different places around the world and even after we have passed away. It's an incredible thing. Of course, the other thing that China has given us is Jade. This is the character for Jade. If you remove the little dot below the central line, it turns into ruler or emperor. It's one of the oldest characters in the Chinese language. So Jade really is a gift to us. And if you see what they're doing with Jade today, it will blow your mind. They say there are two qualities to judge a carving. It should be so well carved that it seems to be impossible that it was created by human hands. And the carving should be invested with life and with movement. And I'll show you a few of those here. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much to you, Mr. Richard Hughes, once again. We take a bow to you for your terrific presentation, sharing your knowledge